and welcome to our first talk in room number 2. And before we start, we have had some news that there was a robbery attempt, so be careful and keep your stuff close. And our first speaker in room number 2 is going to be Rebecca Meritz, that is going to talk about her experience and learnings moving from Django to Rails. So before we start, let's give her a big round of applause.
So, hi, I'm Rebecca Meritz, and as you said, I'm going to talk about my experience moving from Django to Rails. I went from being a full-time Django developer to a full-time Rails developer, and I call this talk a journey from explicit to implicit. So to give you a little overview, I'm going to go and look at some of the differences between the two frameworks. Overall, the big takeaway is they're mostly the same thing, as you probably know. The biggest difference that's quite confusing is the vocabulary, but hopefully that won't be too much of a struggle. And the hope that you'll take away is just gaining some perspective by looking at some of the differences and similarities. And I also want to note that I'm examining both frameworks as they come out of the box. There are many libraries that you could add to either framework that would change their behavior so they could become more similar or more different. And maybe you'll be inspired to use them, but I'm just going to look at them as is without any extra features. So this is my hideous form. I'm not a front-end developer that I've made here. And we're going to talk about the differences between Django and Rails by thinking about this theoretical application for a job recruitment site where you might want to post a job because we all need more recruitment sites. And we're going to look at how we would build this form in both of the different frameworks. So to start out, we're just going to look at the structure of an app, or in Django, what would be a project. So if you've written Django before, you're probably familiar with this structure. The main thing to note here is we have a bunch of different directories. We have the jobs directory. We also have an applicants directory. In each of these directories, we have one models file, one views file, one forms file, etc. In contrast to the application structure in Rails, where instead we have the models directory with a bunch of different models in it, or the controllers directory with a bunch of different controllers in it. Why is this interesting? I think the Rails structure is a lot simpler. You just have one app. You don't have to think that much about it. But I think Django when it creates these mini apps inside your projects, can have smaller conceptual units. So you can think about, what is a concept as opposed to everything just goes in this one app. And this can be a really good thing. It forces you to think about what are the important concepts in your project, but it can be difficult to know what those are early enough on that you don't just have giant models files. So it is a balance. And Rails has something called the lib problem, where you don't know where to put something. It's not a model, it's not a controller, so you stick it in lib. You have all these random files there, and I think because Django is structured around these conceptual units, you don't have the lib problem. So now you know a little about the structure. We're going to talk about the Django templates and the Rails views. So remember that form I showed you. Here's some HTML snippet of the HTML for such a form. Where does that come from? In Django, you might be familiar with this template. I think the main thing to note is that line in the middle with the form as P, the form structured as a paragraph. Django has form classes, and then you just say, display this form. In contrast, Rails has nothing like the form class, and you are going to say, this is the form, we're going to have this field of this type, these are going to be the classes on, and all of that is going to be very explicit in your view or template. I think the main difference between these two solutions is Django makes it really difficult for a designer or someone with very little back-end knowledge to come in and make quick changes to how your app is displayed. And I've seen that be a struggle. However, on the other hand, Django's forms do serve a lot of really nice functions in terms of being really smart about what display types to use for widgets, as well as handling validation in this one small, tight, concrete place. Okay, so how does this user get to find this HTML? They're directed to the correct controller or view via either your URL conf or your routes. And here's urls.py in a Django app. Things to note here, we're spelling out the URL pretty explicitly here, and we're going to use an include to say, actually, we want to look at all the URLs for just our jobs app in another file, which I'll show you here. And here again, we're spelling out the URL explicitly, we're spelling out the view explicitly, and the name explicitly. This is an example of where Django really is very explicit. And here's our config routes for our the same Rails application. And here you can see we're not explicitly spelling out the name of the controller or the actual URL itself. Rails assumes that your application is going to be RESTful and follow the structure of their RESTful URLs. As I said, Django is explicit. And Django is very unopinionated about your application structure, what your URL should look like. On one hand, this can be really great. You have a lot of control. In Rails, you have that control, but it's not the default setting. Whereas Rails gives you REST, which is a really good starting point, but maybe you want more adaptability. So I'm not saying one is definitely better than the other. Another thing to note that it makes, I really like that include where we showed our URLs in our separate file just for the same project. And I think that can be really nice for really easy to be able to drop in the URL structure from another third-party library and just overwrite what you want, which it's actually quite difficult if you want the routes and the controllers / views from a different Rails app to bring them in easily and just bring in the pieces you want. Okay, so those routes or URL-conf has directed you to your views or your controller, and we're going to look at those. So here is a views file. We're using Django's class-based views, which I really love a lot. And here we're using create view because we're creating that job. And as you can see, we have just as many imports as we have code. The code's quite simple here. We just say it's the job model, it's the form class. And actually, this is an example of where Django is actually very not explicit, and you're going to find the opposite in Rails. So what is this create view actually doing? You may be familiar, but we'll look quickly at the actual Django code, or a small piece of it, behind the create view. So this is Django framework code for the create view. This is the post method, which is doing some pretty high level stuff. We're getting that form class, so that's going to build our model for us. And then we're going to see, is that form valid? Is that model going to validate? If it is, we're going to redirect the user in some new way. Otherwise, we'll show the user our errors. So build the model, do an action based on it's valid or it's invalid. All encapsulated in that form, which is something Rails definitely doesn't have anything equivalent to. And now here is the same controller, or it was the view, now it's a controller, for Rails. And we have a method, which we call an action, defined on this controller, create. So we're going to build the job. This time we're building the model, not the form. And we're going to do pretty much the same logic that we just saw in the Django framework code. If we can save the job and that works, then we'll tell the user they succeeded. Otherwise, we're going to have to, we'll render it with the errors so they can fix their form. So you really, So Django's class-based views really encapsulate these common patterns, which can encourage code sharing, which is great. And they're using the template pattern to build these. On one hand, it can be really great. You can have these tiny little views like I showed you. On the other hand, it can be quite problematic. I didn't really show a view like this, but if you're bringing in lots of different mix-ins, or for a new, I think they have like a pretty high learning curve for new people to see where are all these different parts coming from. And the best way to really understand them is to read the source code. And roles controllers are very imperative. Another big difference, which I forgot to point out, is for Django, each view has its own class, as opposed to Rails. So if I was going to add another action, I would add it to that same controller. So a controller file could go, the controller class could grow to be quite large. And I think this is an instance where Django is doing a better job than Rails. Okay. So we have built up this model. It's going to be in the database. We're going to look a little closer at how that's working. I'm going to start with migrations, which is how you're building up this model in the database. And I also want to point out that the structure of how, as a developer, I would work on building these migrations is kind of backwards in both of the apps. So in Django, the first thing I was going to do, if I wanted to build this jobs model, I would open up my models.py file. I would write, say, you know, what are the fields that I want, and specify some information about them. You're probably familiar with that. And here I wanted some timestamps, and I had to write out explicitly how to do that. And then I would make the migrations just for the app that I'm in within my specific project. And now in the Rails, we're actually starting the opposite. So we generate a file to write the migrations. And then we write the migrations. So we haven't even opened up the models file at all. And again, like the code is pretty similar. We say, well, this is the type of fields. These are some extra parameters we want to know about them. And we do have this nice t.timestamps helper, which I think is quite nice. And when you run this migration, the statement of record of what is in your database is going to be in this file schema.rb. So instead of in each models file, you see what attributes you have, they're going to be centralized in this one schema file. Yeah, centralized. I think the centralization has pluses and minuses. I know for me, coming from Django, I found it really bizarre not to be able to go and open up a models file and see like what are all the attributes of this model, because in my mind that was like what I had to work with when I was building on top of my model. And I think Django is trying to do so as I mentioned, as you might know, the migrations in Django are separated out by little projects. So for each, so the jobs project has its own migrations, the applications have its own migrations. And I think they're trying to solve this problem that when you have migrations, you might conflict with other people's migrations. And that's why you want them in their own little separate places. But I think it's a kind of imperfect solution. You may have relationships between your little application, between your apps. And it really doesn't get around the fact that you need to communicate with each other. And I think Rails' solution where they're all in one centralized place and they're just done by timestamp is a really simpler solution there. Okay, so now we have this model in the database. How are we going to access that model? In Django, we use managers. In Rails, we're going to use ARel. Okay, so going back to that models.py, this is the same models as before, but now I'm highlighting that I've added this jobs manager that's going to do our database access. So it's the, and here is the manager itself. And we added another function to do our query manager to do published. So this is a query we might do a lot to see, is this job published on their site or not? So we'll make this helper to make this easier to write. Then we're going to the console, and we're going to access the jobs in the database. And the important thing to note here is we're always going through this manager called objects. You can have a bunch of them, call them a bunch of different things, which is quite nice. But it's always jobs.objects.get. I know when I first started writing Django, I found this, what is this objects thing, very confusing. I don't know if anyone else felt that way. But now, and Rails doesn't use a separate database manager. So the model itself, which is active record base, comes from active record base, has all of the database accessors directly on the model. So if I wanted to add another one, we call that a scope, and I say published, where published is true. So I'm going to do the same thing as the other published, but here, this is directly on this model class. And obviously the big difference is we're not going, there's only one dot here. We're going directly on the objects to do the find, which is equivalent to objects get. And instead of job objects all, we're doing jobs all, job published. So I think all the scopes that Rails have can really clutter the object, and I think it's quite nice to have a separate class to put all these different scopes on. However, and another thing that's quite nice about Django's managers is that they allow the model itself to have a cleaner API. In Rails, once you start writing a model, you have over hundreds of methods already on your method before you add any. Hundreds of methods already on your class before you even add anything. Okay, so that's the code I'm going to show you. There's also some big philosophical differences and some small philosophical differences between the two platforms. I'm going to talk about some things I like about the philosophies of both of them. So in Django's Python. Python uses PEP 8. I really like PEP 8. I know I'm going to open any piece of Python. It's probably going to look pretty similar. I would love writing Ruby a lot, but there is a lot of syntax sugar, and there's not really clear agreement about what is the best way to write Ruby code. And another thing that I think is really great about Django is the culture of documentation surrounding it. It's obviously not universally true, but overall I think the docs surrounding more libraries used in Django are of higher quality. A lot of people are using read the docs, and a lot of people are bothering to write tutorials and really explaining what methods are meant to do, and not just being like, here's a list of methods, here's a list of classes, which is quite a bit more common in Rails. And then obviously my favorite Python feature, which I miss dearly, is explicit imports. They're really great, and you probably know that if you're here. But I'm not just hating on my switch to Rails. I think there are a lot of great things about Rails. Rails really values that out of the box you have a system that works really well. Django does too, but I don't think to the same degree. And one of the things I really see that it obviously is logging. I think the defaults that they have set up for you are really nice, and it's set up to work both in your test environment and your development environment and your production environment automatically. You can always tweak it, you can tweak anything. But I think this is a really handy place to start. I also think that the tools around packaging are nicer in Rails. Gem is a lot more powerful than pip, and also one thing that I really like about packaging in Rails is that there are fewer options. Obviously everyone wants to improve upon the way things work now, but I think that means that the environment in Python is that no one knows what to choose, and sometimes just one solution is better. Another thing, one of the things that makes me most excited about moving to Rails is Ruby's great functional programming support. Python's moving away from it, which makes me sad. But I think there's just a lot more functional programming built into Ruby, and it's a lot more encouraged as a coding style. As well as another coding style thing is I think Rails really values readability. they have lots of functions with really long names, which I'm really into, as well as things like 30.days gives you the number of days, and like seeing that makes me really happy. Okay, I think I rushed through that, but thanks for listening. I think the point of what I'm trying to show is not that, oh, Django is great or Rails is great, just that they have some differences, and I think seeing those differences gave me a lot of great perspective about the positive points and negative points of each. At the end of the day, they're both web frameworks, and I'm not going to tell you choose the best tool for the job, because they're pretty much the same tool. But yeah, maybe you'll be inspired to try something new out yourself. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you say something about virtual env versus equivalences in Ruby?
I could. I don't know what I would have to say. This is actually a place where Ruby has a bunch of different options. I don't know why there are so many. I'm using RBM. I think it's pretty okay. I don't know. We both are solving the same problem in very similar ways. I don't think I have something exciting to say about it, which is why I didn't talk about it.
Hi. How would you compare testing with Rails and Django?
Yes. I probably bet a lot of you thought I was going to talk a lot about testing, because Rails is famous for being in love with testing. And definitely testing in Rails is way better. I think my favorite thing is Capybara. I don't know if anyone's used Capybara. So we have like Django Selenium, and we have web test in Django. But what Capybara, this library, is giving you is the ability to switch really easily between any of these integration platforms and just change the backend. And our lovely, one sec. I think the support is better. But I think a lot of what's happening is there is already a lot of cross between the communities. They're very similar languages. And I see, I used a thing called VCR, which you can, is a testing library that allows you to capture your requests. And someone has ported it and made a VCR, I don't know what it's called in Django, but made the same thing. And as well as I use Factory Boy in Django, that's obviously coming from Rails. So there already is a lot of cross-breeding, but I do think, irregardless, the tooling is better, and not just the tooling, but a lot of it is just cultural, that there's an expectation that, of course, you're going to do this. And I think that's actually sort of an exchange, are you going to take the time for documentation, or are you going to take time for tests? And really great tests can be documenting, but it's also really hard to write really great tests.
I just wanted to compliment that Capybara, there's a Python version kind of for Capybara, which is called Splinter. I'm not sure if anybody here knows it. It's from Brazil, actually. A friend of mine started it a few years ago, and it supports various drivers like Phantom.js and Selenium and a lot of other drivers, headless drivers too. So there's actually an option in Python
that's great to
for
know.
Capybara, yeah.
I wish more people knew, which is why we're here.
Yep. Just curious, what's the business rationale to switch from Django to Rails? Because of course it's operation.
I don't think there is one. I think people build apps and whatever they can because they can hire developers that can do that, and I think that's the biggest business rationale. I don't think they're different enough that you would choose one versus the other. Probably in Stockholm it's easier to hire Django developers, and in Boston, where I'm from, it's probably easier to hire Rails developers. I think it's been interesting to do something different, but I don't think it's like, oh, I really wanted to write Rails because Rails is the answer and Django isn't the answer. And I don't think I don't think I expressed that in my talk either. I don't think there's some clear business case for one or the other. I think who you can hire is probably a more important business case there.
What do you miss from Django now that you work with Rails the most?
I think of all the things I talked about, and I touched on this, was I really like class-based views, and I miss them a lot. I'm like a super class-based views enthusiast, and if anyone's still using those functional type views, you should switch, because you should.
Did you try document-based backends as opposed to relational backends? And do you see a difference between both?
I have no experience using Rails or Django with document-based backends, so I used one in Erlang, but that's not really relevant at all. So I have nothing to say about this topic. I'm sorry. You can obviously welcome to talk to me afterwards. I'll be around.
So thank you a lot.